Hello and welcome back to my channel. In this week's episode, I'm going to be discussing what is going on in Yemen and the serious humanitarian disaster the country is facing right now. And if you're new here, my name is Nick Ford and I post videos about politics and what is going on in the world. So if topics like that are interesting to you, make sure you subscribe so you won't miss next week's episode. And also, I'm now on Patreon, so if you want to support me and the work I do, you can follow the link down below to my Patreon account and become a subscriber. You can also follow me on Instagram and Twitter. Those links will be down below as well. So the crisis in Yemen has been going on for more than 5 years now. And I'm not going to get too into the weeds of the conflict or how it started because that has been covered a lot before. All you need to know is that a coalition of Gulf states called the Gulf Cooperation Council, also known as the GCC, led by Saudi Arabia, is trying to forcefully reinstall a dictatorship in Yemen that would be sympathetic to their own interests. And that is the government of Mansour Hadi, who was forced to flee Yemen when the war started in 2015. Hadi fled when a Shia militia known as the Houthis took over large parts of western Yemen, including the capital Sana'a. Initially, the Houthis were not supported by Iran, but the Saudis, as well as the rest of the GCC, feared that they were, and they started to intervene in order to reinstall their man Hadi as president. And now, since the war started, the GCC and the Saudis in particular have stopped at nothing in order to defeat the Houthis. This has included thousands of Saudi bombing raids, many of which have hit hospitals, schools, and even water treatment facilities. And the reason the Saudis are so involved in the war is because they believe they are vulnerable from attack by Iran from across the Persian Gulf, and now from their southern border through the Houthis. But just because the Saudis and the GCC fear being encircled by Iran does not excuse the horrible human rights atrocities that they have caused in Yemen over the past 5 years. Now, the situation Yemen finds itself in 2020, is very, very poor. Yemen was already going through the world's worst humanitarian disaster, and now its healthcare system has pretty much collapsed under the weight of the pandemic.
COVID-19 has brought Yemen's health system to a complete collapse. That's according to the medical charity Doctors Without Borders. The real numbers of dead there are almost impossible to determine, with low levels of testing and some authorities suppressing the true death toll.
Now, it's also important to note that the dire situation Yemen found itself in at the beginning of this year was entirely human-made. And all these people that are suffering inside the country are now immunocompromised, which means they are at a much higher risk of dying if they catch COVID-19. And what's worse, health experts say COVID-19 is rapidly spreading across the entire country, almost undetected because of the seriously low rates of testing. It's a pretty grim situation, but how does the West fit into all this? Well, Amnesty International has found that a lot of Western states have actually been profiting off the war by selling weapons and arms to the Saudis and the UAE, with most of it coming from the US.
We've become very good friends over a fairly short period of time. I was in Saudi Arabia in May, and we are bringing back hundreds of billions of dollars into the United States. You look in terms of dollars, $3 billion, $533 million, $525 million. That's peanuts for you.
According to a Washington-based think tank called Security Assistance Monitor, the US has sold $14 billion worth of weapons to the Saudis and the Emiratis between 2015 and 2019. And that doesn't include an $8 billion transaction last year that Congress successfully blocked. However, that was eventually overridden by Trump's veto, and that transaction still went ahead.
For the second time during his mandate at the White House, Donald Trump has wielded his power of veto, this time to block a resolution which aimed to end US military assistance to the Saudi coalition fighting Iran-backed rebels in Yemen.
And this is not just a Trump problem, because before Trump, Obama actually held the record for the largest weapon sales to Saudi Arabia of any US president. And both Trump and Obama are guilty of selling cluster munitions to the Saudis, which have been banned in 119 countries because they indiscriminately target civilians. And according to Ban Ki-moon, the former Secretary General of the United Nations, the use of cluster bombs could amount to war crimes. Second to the US was the United Kingdom, with about $7 billion of weapon sales to the Saudis since 2015, according to the UK NGO Campaign Against Arms Trade. And a UK court actually ruled last year that their weapon sales to the Saudis were a violation of their own laws. However, that ruling was overturned earlier this year. And various other Western countries have also sold weapons to the Saudis over the last 5 years, according to Amnesty International, including my own country, Australia, as well as Canada, Spain, France, Germany, and many others. But what is worse is that a leaked and classified document from the French Directorate of Military Intelligence found that the Saudis are overwhelmingly dependent on weapons made by the West. Almost their entire military outfit, which includes aircraft, helicopters, tanks, artillery guns, and even ships, have been made and produced by Western countries. And this claim is actually backed up by an NGO called the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, that estimated that 60% of all weapons used by the Saudis were made by the US. So obviously over the past 5 years, Western countries could have easily stopped the war that has created the world's worst humanitarian disaster, but instead they've been profiting off it. And now, to the fault of the West and Iran for funding the Houthis, Yemen is probably the worst placed country in the world to deal with the pandemic. But unfortunately, that isn't the worst part. The worst part is that Western countries have known for years that their weapons were being used to target civilians and civilian infrastructure in Yemen, such as hospitals, weddings, funerals, water treatment facilities, and even schools. A former US State Department official in the Obama administration named Jeremy Konyodyke told a House committee last year that when he was working for USAID in 2016, they used to supply the Saudis with no-strike lists. These were lists of civilian infrastructures that the Saudis should avoid targeting with their airstrikes. But the Saudis completely disregarded it and ended up bombing the already identified civilian infrastructures anyway. Konyodyke said, in August 2016, the Saudis bombed a bridge along the road that carries most of Yemen's food aid, a road that had been specifically cited on the US no-strike lists, assembled by my team at USAID. That same month, they bombed an NGO hospital days after also bombing a school. Despite our best efforts, the attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure continued, and continued, and continued. So the only conclusion that you can draw from that is that Saudi Arabia is either intentionally targeting civilian infrastructure, or they are grossly negligent in avoiding it. And that's actually the conclusion Ted Lieu, a Democratic politician from California, reached in 2016. He said, Saudi Arabia is either intentionally targeting civilians or deliberately indifferent in executing its military operations. Either way, there's no good reason any country should be supplying weapons to Saudi Arabia that allows them to do these kind of things. And because of the repeated bombings of medical facilities, only half of Yemen's hospitals are currently operational. And that's very bad news for a country that's going through a pandemic. An NGO called the Yemeni Archive found that between 2014 and 2019, medical facilities had been attacked 133 times. The majority of those attacks were by the Saudis, who bombed medical facilities a total of 72 times. The Yemeni Archive found 11 hospitals and medical facilities that had been bombed more than once, and because of that, a lot of them had gone out of service. And they even found one hospital had been bombed a total of 9 times. But it's not just hospitals. The Saudis have even bombed water treatment facilities, which has cut off clean drinking water to thousands of Yemenis and has helped create one of the biggest cholera outbreaks in human history.
This cholera scandal is entirely man-made by the conflicting parties and those beyond Yemen's borders who are leading, supplying, fighting and perpetuating the fear and the fighting.
And back in 2018, UNICEF reported that the Saudis had just bombed one of their water treatment facilities for the 3rd time, which they estimated cut off around 10,000 Yemenis from fresh, clean drinking water. Now, with the healthcare system in Yemen absolutely decimated, and with millions of Yemenis lacking clean drinking water, Yemen is in no way capable of dealing with this pandemic. And a spokesperson from the UN has said that Yemen's healthcare system has already, in effect, collapsed. So what should happen now? Well, I think it's obvious. As the saying goes, you broke it, you fix it. Western countries should come together and help rebuild and repair Yemen's broken healthcare system, especially since they made so much profit destroying it. But unfortunately, that hasn't happened yet. Yemen is facing massive funding shortfalls this year, and it has been estimated that 75% of UN programs in Yemen have had to close, and UN-funded health services have been reduced in more than half of Yemen's hospitals. And it's not just that. The World Food Programme has had to cut their food rations for families in half. But fortunately for Yemen, Saudi Arabia is having a pretty poor year and their economy isn't doing so well. So they have agreed to a unilateral ceasefire. So maybe the war will be over for now. But this came way too late and has left Yemen in a catastrophic position. And the ceasefire might not even hold. The failure to stop the war is also apparent in the news coverage of it, or the lack of. Despite being the worst humanitarian crisis in the world, Yemen still receives almost no coverage in any of the mainstream media organizations. And that has led Amnesty International to dub the conflict the Forgotten War. For example, Al Jazeera found that in 2017, the 24-hour news station MSNBC devoted just 3 minutes to covering Yemen.
MSNBC is a 24-hour news channel Americans consider to be on the liberal side of the political spectrum. In 2017, the network produced exactly one news report on Yemen. One. MSNBC had 8,760 hours of airtime to fill last year. The total time it devoted to the Yemen story and the American angle in it, 3 minutes and 7 seconds.
And finally, if you want to help out, you should consider donating to Doctors Without Borders. They're still in the country despite everything that's gone on, and they've been attacked and bombed by both sides in the war. And they're keeping a lot of Yemen's hospitals operational, even though a lot of other people have left. And that's all I have on this topic. So if you like the video and you want to help me out, you can subscribe. And if you want to follow me on Twitter and Instagram, those links will be down below as well. Cheers, and thanks for watching.